The air inside the Grand Royal Infirmary smelled of dried rosemary and boiling water. Lyra Thorne stood by the long slate table, carefully lifting a set of silver scalpels from the heated copper basin. The metal was scalding, but she did not use the heavy leather tongs hanging by the furnace. Instead, she pressed the edge of a linen cloth against the handles, letting the heat seep through the fabric just enough to warm her joints. 3 years ago, the cold of the northern winds had settled deep into her bones, and the quiet chill of the imperial capital's stone corridors had done little to chase it away. She wiped the first blade until the silver gleamed under the high, arched windows. Her thumb dragged across the smooth surface, catching briefly on a patch of raised skin. Lyra lowered her gaze to her hands. The pads of her fingers were mapped with tiny, shallow scars. They were the physical records of her early, clumsy attempts at handling medicinal blades, the jagged slips of a woman who had never been taught the anatomy of healing. She pressed one small white scar against the cold flat of the metal, holding the pressure until the sting grounded her in the present. Once, Alpha King Julian Vane had looked at those same hands as they folded his winter cloaks. He had declared them entirely useless for anything beyond fetching firewood and holding his wine glass. The memory did not bring the sharp twist in her chest that it used to. Silence was a kind of armor, thinner than most, but lighter to carry. She had packed her single wooden trunk in that silence. She had signed the divorce decrees without a tremor, leaving the Crescent Pack territory before the heavy black ink had even finished drying. Now, she aligned the sterilized silver scalpels in a precise row on the velvet-lined tray. Each instrument had a specific purpose, a specific angle designed to separate diseased tissue from healthy flesh without damaging the core. The methodical process required absolute focus, leaving no room for the ghosts of a broken mating bond. Lyra picked up a small vial of cedar oil, applying a single drop to the hinges of the surgical shears. The sharp, resinous scent filled the narrow space between the stone walls, entirely overriding the faint, copper tang of the iron. She was no longer a discarded Omega shrinking under the weight of a royal hall. She was simply a practitioner of the sovereign order, measuring her worth in clean cuts and saved lives. The heavy oak door at the back of the laboratory creaked, breaking the absolute stillness of the morning. Cassie Miller slipped inside, carrying a woven basket filled with bundles of rare frost herbs. The young acolyte's breathing was uneven, her boots scuffing against the polished floorboards in her haste. She set the basket down on the edge of the adjacent workbench, her shoulders pulled tight toward her ears. The glowing blue leaves of the winter plants pulsed faintly in the dim light, requiring immediate sorting before their medicinal properties began to fade. Lyra moved toward the bench, her footsteps completely silent against the stone. She did not rush, nor did she demand an explanation for the younger woman's frazzled entrance. Instead, she picked up a pair of iron snips and began to separate the frost herbs from their thick, fibrous roots. Cassie grabbed a small crystal vial from the upper shelf, her hands trembling so violently that the glass rattled against the wooden backing. The acolyte was trying to speak, her words stumbling over each other as she relayed the rumors, echoing through the lower courtyards. There was talk of a mysterious blight spreading through the northern provinces, a toxic mist that turned the soil to ash and left the border patrols coughing up black blood. Cassie spoke of the panic in the outer markets, her voice pitching higher with every sentence. Her fingers fumbled with the delicate stopper of the vial. The glass slipped from her sweaty grip, plummeting toward the hard slate floor. Before the vial could shatter against the stone, Lyra's hand shot out, catching the glass perfectly in her palm. She set it gently back onto the shelf. The sovereign healer pressed her thumb against the inside of Cassie's wrist, waiting for the frantic pulse to slow into a steady rhythm. The glowing blue leaves of the frost herbs illuminated their faces, casting long shadows across the laboratory walls. The northern blight was still just a rumor, a distant threat separated from the capital by hundreds of miles of mountains. Lyra turned her attention back to the fibrous roots, systematically sorting the harvest by potency. The High Court had its protocols, and until an official decree reached the infirmary, her only duty was to preserve the medicine. The wait was brief. A courier arrived just before the mid-morning bells struck, leaving a trail of melting snow across the stone tiles of the infirmary antechamber. He carried no standard requisition forms, only a dispatch sealed in thick black wax. Lyra took the parchment from the silver tray, the stiff vellum cold against her fingertips. She did not immediately break it open. Instead, she stood by the tall, arched window, holding the document to the pale winter light. The wax bore the unmistakable stamp of a crescent moon over crossed pines. It was the territorial crest of Julian's lands. She pressed her thumb against the rigid emblem, feeling the broken edges of the seal. She traced the fractured wax, noting how the heavy script along the margins was flaking away. Freezing gusts sapped the moisture from fresh writing before it could fully set, and the rider had clearly pushed his mount through a brutal gale to deliver this plea. There was a time when holding a letter from that estate would have caused a visceral reaction. A tightening of the throat, a frantic pulse against her collarbone. Now, her steady hand simply snapped the seal in half and unfolded the page with absolute clinical precision. The handwriting was erratic, dictated in a rush by a provincial magistrate. It detailed a massive ecological collapse along the northern boundary lines. A dense, toxic mist had settled into the lower valleys of the Crescent territory, moving aggressively into the high-altitude villages. The symptoms were meticulously recorded, reading like a textbook case of necrotic blight. Rapid respiratory decay, blackened veins, and a complete failure of the shifter biology to heal the corrupted tissue. The local healers were outmatched. The mortality rate was climbing by the hour, forcing the surviving packs to retreat. They formally petitioned the High Court for emergency intervention. Lyra walked over to her wide drafting table and pulled the provincial ledger from its iron stand. The thick leather binding creaked softly as she laid it flat. She turned the yellowed pages, the scent of old dust rising, until she reached the geographical registries for the northern borders. Her eyes scanned the intricate topography, calculating the wind currents and rock barriers that would trap a localized miasma. This mist was not a sudden weather anomaly. According to the records beneath her fingers, it was a stagnant rot, a festering consequence of neglected land management in the territory she had walked away from 3 years ago. She picked up a thin charcoal stick and began making marginal notes directly onto the ledger's parchment sheets. She listed the required tonnage of refined frost herbs, the necessary sterilization equipment, and the precise caravan routes that would bypass the infected zones. There was no hesitation in her movements, no lingering memory of the cold keep that was currently suffocating under the toxic fog. She simply treated the crisis as a mathematical equation of supply and biological response. The woman who had once been dismissed as useless to the survival of a proud pack was now quietly drafting the logistical blueprint that would keep them from going extinct. The heavy oak door to the laboratory did not slam open, but a sudden shift in the room's air pressure signaled a fundamental change in authority. Lyra set her charcoal down as Alistair stepped over the threshold. He wore his dark velvet cloak draped over practical riding leathers, bringing the sharp scent of cedar and crushed frost into the sterile environment. The Sovereign did not ask for a verbal summary of the crisis. He walked directly to the drafting table, his gaze dropping to the open provincial ledger and the precise calculations she had already mapped across the parchment. Alistair Vance occupied silence, the way other men occupied speech, without apology, without the nervous impulse to fill it. He read the dire symptom list forwarded from the Crescent pack, his expression remaining entirely neutral. He'd traced the caravan route she had drawn with one black-gloved finger, noting the ruthless efficiency of her designated supply chains. He understood exactly whose territory was failing. More importantly, he understood exactly who was standing beside him, charting their rescue without a single tremor in her breathing. He turned his head slowly, assessing her straight posture and the quiet, unbroken focus in her eyes. There were no invasive questions about her emotional readiness, no condescending inquiries about whether she could separate her past humiliation from her present duty. Her meticulous work on the table was the only proof he required. Alistair reached into the deep interior pocket of his cloak and withdrew a heavy, ancient iron ring. It held the master keys to the imperial medicinal vaults, items that had never been entrusted to an outsider in the entire history of the court. The cold metal chimed softly as he held the ring out, suspended from his long fingers. Lyra looked at the jagged keys, recognizing the imperial crests carved deep into the iron teeth. Taking them meant assuming absolute control over the highest medical authority on the continent. It meant she alone would vet the desperate foreign petitioners arriving at the Great Jade Hall, and she alone would dictate who received the life-saving reserves. She raised her hand, keeping her wrist perfectly straight, and let the heavy iron drop solid into her palm. Their eyes met in a silent agreement of shared respect and heavy duty. Not a single vow of fealty was spoken aloud, and no grand declarations of loyalty were demanded. Alistair simply nodded once, formally acknowledging the immense shift in her rank. By handing her the unhindered vault access, he had officially elevated her to the unprecedented role of Grand Sovereign Healer. He turned and walked back toward the door, leaving her alone with the provincial ledger and the quiet, absolute power she had earned entirely in the shadows. The dressing chamber of the Grand Royal Infirmary smelled of dried lavender and beeswax, a sharp contrast to the biting winter frost outside the high windows. Cassie Miller stood quietly behind Lyra Thorne, holding the heavy folds of the state robes over her forearms. The fabric was immaculate, untouched by the dust or blood of the lower wards. These double-lined silks of pure white were reserved exclusively for the supreme leader of the medical guild. Cassie draped the thick material over Lyra's shoulders. The silk made a low, rushing sound against the cold stone floor, a sound of weight and consequence that filled the silent room. Lyra stood perfectly still, her breathing measured as the younger acolyte adjusted the rigid collar. The white silk rested heavily against her collarbones. It was not a delicate garment for display. The fabric was dense, tightly woven to resist the chill of the imperial towers and the accidental splatter of volatile compounds. It felt like armor. Lyra looked straight ahead into the polished silver mirror resting on the cedar table. She remembered a different dress. 3 years ago, she had stood in a drafty antechamber in the Crescent territory, wearing a cheap, hurried grey lace. It offered no warmth against the northern wind. The colour had been chosen by the pack elders to make the newly appointed Omega Luna as unobtrusive and easily forgotten as possible. The poor quality thread had scratched at her wrists, a physical reminder of her low rank. "The silver clasps, Grand Healer?" Cassie asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Lyra blinked, bringing the reflection in the silver mirror back into sharp focus. "Yes, fasten them at the clavicle. Ensure the fabric lies completely flat." Cassie produced 2 heavy silver pins shaped like the sovereign crest, pressing the cool metal through the thick silk. The sharp click of the clasps, locking into place, echoed in the quiet chamber like a vault sealing shut. The grey lace was gone. This dress was not meant to please a distant mate or appease a hostile court. It demanded obedience, It carried the full legal authority of the sovereign order, a visual mandate that she was now above provincial politics. "The drape is correct," Lyra noted, observing the perfectly even hemline near her polished leather boots. She traced a hand down the stiff fabric. It did not yield easily. It was built for endurance, for standing long hours in the great Jade Hall, and for commanding the complex supply lines of the entire imperial territory. The blinding white color was a warning to disease, to corruption, and to dissent alike. Cassie stepped back, lowering her head in a deep, formal bow. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the steady burning of beeswax candles and the faint crackle of the hearth. Lyra turned away from the mirror. The heavy silk followed her movement, snapping faintly at the ankles. She did not look back at the reflection. The woman in the grey lace belonged to a past that no longer existed. While the dressing chamber remained sealed, in quiet preparation, the outer vestibule of the Imperial Sovereign Court echoed with erratic footsteps. Garrick Stone pushed through the heavy bronze entry doors, his shoulder hitting the metal with an uncoordinated thud. His heavy leather boots dragged against the immaculate marble floor, leaving faint trails of grey ash and dry mud. The High Guards immediately levelled their steel halberds, their pristine uniforms, contrasting sharply with his ruined physical state. Garrick halted, leaning heavily against the polished stone archway, his chest heaving under his tarnished breastplate. His throat was entirely dry, stripped of moisture more by the toxic dust choking the northern provinces. Every breath drew a harsh, rattling sound from his lungs, a loud and ugly noise in the pristine quiet of the capital. He kept his gaze fixed rigidly on the marble beneath his boots, gripping his sword hilt not as a weapon, but as a crutch. "Identify," the captain of the guard demanded, his voice flat and echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Garrick swallowed hard. Garrick, emissary of the Crescent Pack. He coughed, a dry, scraping noise that forced him to bend forward. "I bring an urgent petition. Alpha King Julian Vane approaches the capital." At the far end of the vestibule, a shadow detached itself from a columned alcove. High Sovereign Alistus Vance stepped into the light, wearing a dark, unadorned wool coat. His movements were completely unhurried. He did not demand attention, yet the entire vestibule immediately oriented toward him, the way iron filings align to a lodestone. The guards snapped their halberds into an upright salute. Alistair ignored the display, walking slowly toward the struggling emissary. "Your Alpha travels under pressure, I presume," Alistair stated. His voice was low, carrying effortlessly across the marble without the need for volume. Garrick tightened his jaw, tasting the bitter copper of his own blood. "He is half a day behind me. The blight has crossed the river. We are losing the borders, and the sick are overwhelming the remaining shelters." Alistair stopped a few paces away. He did not offer a cup of water or a chair. He simply observed the grey ash flaking off the emissary's leather armor. The physical degradation of the man exposed the geopolitical collapse of his pack. The Crescent territory, once proud, self-sufficient, and fiercely protective of its independence, was caving inward. They had no resources left to combat the mystical poison. They had nothing left but the willingness to beg their superiors for survival. "The Sovereign Order has received the preliminary reports regarding the toxic mist," Alistair replied smoothly. "The petition will be heard formally in the Great Jade Hall." Garrick finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot and stinging from the harsh light of the capital. "The Alpha King requests direct access to the Grand Healer upon arrival. We cannot afford diplomatic delays. Lives are ending by the hour." "The Grand Healer determines her own schedule," Alistair answered, the words dropping like heavy stones into still water. "Your Alpha will wait until the heavy bronze doors are opened, not a single moment before." Garrick lowered his head, too physically depleted to argue. The dry cough racked his ribs once more, leaving him gasping for clean air. He understood the stark reality. The Crescent Pack had lost its sovereignty the exact moment he crossed this threshold. They were entirely at the mercy of the Imperial Court now, and the man who ruled it would not be rushed. The acoustics of the High Gallery were designed to make a man feel small, a deliberate, architectural choice by the sovereign order to humble visiting warlords. Julian Vane stood near the center of the vast expanse of polished green stone, his broad shoulders pulled downward by a fatigue that went deeper than bone. For 3 continuous days, he had ridden without stopping, leaving behind a territory choking on toxic mist. The memory of his northern territories' coughing children and dying elders clung to him like a second skin, a heavy, suffocating mantle of failure. Yet here, inside the imperial capital, the air was entirely different. It was thin, aggressively filtered, and thick with the sharp, astringent bite of medicinal incense burning in tall brass braziers along the walls. He hated this room. The wild, raw instincts of a northern pack leader demanded soil, wind, and open sky when threatened. The sterile, silent environment of the court offered none of those comforts. There were no natural shadows to hide in, only the unyielding glare of light reflecting off the jade floor. Julian compulsively dragged his palms down the sides of his worn leather trousers. The rough friction of the hide was the only grounding sensation he had left in a space that felt entirely alien. His knuckles were cracked, stained with dried mud and the faint rust of old blood from the desperate journey, serving as a stark, ugly contrast to the immaculate, dustless environment surrounding him. Beside him, Garrick Stone remained perfectly still. The stern enforcer of the High Court regulations watched the heavy bronze doors at the far end of the hall without a single twitch of muscle. Garrick wore the dark, tailored uniform of his station, exuding a rigid professionalism that only made the rural alpha feel more feral and out of place. Julian shifted his weight from one booted foot to the other, the faint squeak of his footwear echoing far too loudly against the vaulted ceiling. His inner wolf was pacing relentlessly, driven half-mad by the clinical lack of scent. There was no prey here, no rivals to fight, no tangible enemy to tear apart with teeth and claws. There was only waiting, and the crushing reality that his territorial sovereignty meant absolutely nothing within these walls. He was a beggar in his own kingdom, forced to submit to the bureaucratic machinery of the medical elite. Every passing minute felt like another grave being dug back in his home territory. Julian pressed the heel of his hand against his brow, trying to push away the creeping headache born from the oppressive, antiseptic silence. He had always ruled by presence, by the sheer gravity of his physical strength and the dominant edge of his voice. But the sovereign order did not respect fangs or brute force. They respected ledgers, formulas, and ancient jurisdiction. He suffered the specific, quiet agony of witnessing an inevitable truth, the confirmation that raw power could not cure a poisoned aquifer, and that his pride had to be completely swallowed if he wanted his people to survive the winter. He stopped rubbing his trousers and forced his hands to fall to his sides, curling them into tight, useless fists. He would kneel if he had to. He would offer them whatever exorbitant price they demanded. The grinding mechanism of the inner sanctum doors suddenly interrupted the agonizing quiet. Heavy iron gears turned deep within the stone walls, the sound low and resonant, vibrating through the thick soles of Julian's boots. He straightened his spine immediately, rolling his stiff shoulders backward as a bright, sharp beam of natural light spilled out from the widening gap. The massive bronze doors swung outward, revealing the raised dais of the Supreme Medical Guild. Above the platform, a massive glass skylight cut through the vaulted ceiling, allowing the cold, pale afternoon sun to pour directly onto the center stage. Julian prepared to lower his head. He had rehearsed his plea endlessly during the long ride south, practicing the precise, measured tone of deference required to beg the grand healer for the rare frost herb antidote. He kept his gaze fixed on the polished marble steps of the dais, waiting for the rustle of fabric that would signal the arrival of the supreme authority. The sound came moments later, a soft, expensive sweep of heavy silk gliding over stone. It was a measured, unhurried cadence. The pacing of someone who owned the room completely, someone who occupied silence the way other men occupied speech, without apology, without the nervous impulse to fill it. He raised his eyes to meet the official, and the carefully rehearsed words evaporated from his throat. His jaw locked. The man who had faced down rival packs and survived brutal northern winters stopped breathing entirely. Standing at the top of the dais was Lyra Thorne. She wore the pristine, double-lined white state robes reserved exclusively for the supreme leader of the medical guild. The immaculate fabric cascaded down her form, catching the indifferent light of the high skylight, making her look less like a person and more like an untouchable monument of the state. Her dark hair was bound back in severe, elegant braids, and her posture was a flawless line of absolute composure. But it was not just the visual shock that paralyzed him. Beneath the sharp, overwhelming bite of the room's medicinal incense, his heightened senses caught the faint, undeniable scent of rosemary and cedar. It was his ex-wife, the woman he had discarded 3 years ago, because her quiet nature had been deemed insufficient for a ruling alpha. The realization did not hit the pack leader like a sudden, violent blow. Instead, it was a slow, creeping freeze that started at the base of his spine and turned the blood in his veins to solid ice. His chest tightened until his ribs ached with the sheer pressure of it. The wolf inside him, which had been pacing frantically just moments before, completely stilled, whining low in absolute confusion and shock. This was not a bride standing before him. This was not a rejected mate returning to flaunt a new lover in a display of petty revenge. The white dress she wore was a uniform of supreme, undeniable authority. The woman who had packed a single wooden trunk and walked out of his fortress, without shedding a single tear, now stood far above him, holding the absolute power of life and death over his entire bloodline. She looked down at him with eyes that held no anger, no vindictiveness, and no lingering affection. It was a look of pure, clinical observation. The vast, empty distance between them was no longer just physical. It was an impassable chasm built on 3 years of unyielding discipline and silent endurance. Julian remained frozen, a king reduced to a supplicant, entirely trapped in the gravity of the woman he had thrown away. But the shock in his chest soon overrode 3 years of political conditioning. Breaking from his paralysis, Julian moved before his mind could measure the distance to the dais. His heavy boots scraped sharply against the polished obsidian floor, a harsh sound that fractured the absolute stillness of the immense audience chamber. He opened his mouth, the syllables of her personal name already forming on his tongue, driven by a primal impulse to bridge the impossible gap between the memory of his discarded mate and the untouchable figure standing above him. He did not make it past the second step. The movement of the royal sentinels was not aggressive. It was merely inevitable. 2 towering guards flanking the lower stairs shifted in perfect unison, their heavy armor creaking faintly in the cavernous space. The thick iron hafts of their weapons struck the stone floor first, sending a deep vibration traveling upward through the soles of Julian's boots. Then came the sharp, metallic clang of the crossing halberds. The broad steel blades locked together at his chest height, forming an impenetrable barrier of cold metal. The sound echoed up into the vaulted ceiling, ringing against the massive jade pillars before fading into the vast, unforgiving architecture of the imperial sovereign court. Julian stopped, the breath catching hard in his throat. The sentinels did not speak, nor did they turn their heads to look at him. Their faces remained obscured by featureless silver visors, their posture rigidly aligned with the ancient protocols of the crown. They did not need to issue a verbal threat. The crossed steel was a physical manifestation of the boundary he had just attempted to violate. Back in his own territory, his forward step would have commanded immediate deference. Here, under the high skylight of the capital, his alpha status carried absolutely no weight against the supreme authority of the sovereign order. He stared at the sharp edge of the halberd resting mere inches from his sternum. The metal gleamed with a dull, practical oil finish, meant for lethal use rather than ceremonial decoration. Slowly, deliberately, the man forced himself to step backward. The soles of his boots felt heavy, dragging against the flawless stone surface. The guards remained motionless, their weapons still firmly locked, maintaining the enforced distance without a single flinch. The physical reality of his powerlessness settled into his bones like deep winter frost. He could not order these men to stand down. He could not demand an audience or invoke his pack lineage. The woman standing at the top of the dais was protected by a jurisdiction older and stronger than his entire bloodline. He was merely a petitioner from a dying province, and she was the highest medical authority in the empire. The immense political machinery of the capital stood between them, solid and unyielding as the crossed steel. Above the barrier of the halberds, Lyra watched his retreat without shifting her weight. She did not clutch the edges of her pristine state robes, nor did her chin tremble. Her hands rested lightly on the polished wooden rim of the grand podium, her fingers completely relaxed. The chaotic energy, radiating from the lower floor, washed over her and dissipated against the clinical focus she had spent 3 years perfecting. She looked down at the man who had once exiled her into the snow, studying his ruined posture the exact same way she might observe a contaminated slide under a brass lens. Alpha King Vane. Her voice carried through the cavernous hall, steady and entirely devoid of inflection. The title hung in the cold air, formal and distant. It was the exact cadence she used when addressing junior acolytes in the laboratory, or foreign merchants seeking standard poultices. She did not inflect the words with malice, nor did she lace them with the triumph of a discarded woman claiming her vengeance. There was only the measured, undeniable rhythm of protocol. Julian's shoulders jerked upward at the sound of his official designation. The formal address from her lips was a surgical cut, severing whatever fragile thread of personal history he had tried to grasp in his panic. He looked up, his jaw tight, searching her features for any flicker of the girl who had once packed a single wooden trunk in absolute silence. She offered him nothing. Lyra slowly turned her attention to the heavy brass-bound file resting on the podium. The crisp rustle of thick parchment turning under her thumb echoed loudly in the quiet space. She smoothed the heavy paper flat, her eyes scanning the official request submitted by the Crescent delegation days prior. "The Sovereign Order acknowledges your petition," Lyra continued, her gaze remaining fixed on the ink rather than the petitioner below. "Your territory reports a casualty rate that has exceeded the threshold of provincial management. As Grand Sovereign Healer, I have been authorized to evaluate the progression of the toxicity within your borders." She paused, lifting a silver-nibbed pen to make a small notation in the margin of the document. The scratch of the metal tip against the rough parchment was deliberate, unhurried, marking the passage of seconds while the Alpha waited. "We will conduct this assessment strictly according to the parameters set by the Crown," she stated, finally raising her eyes back to him. Her gaze was as cool and clear as river ice. "You will provide the exact logistical data regarding the affected sectors. In return, the institution will determine the necessary allocation of resources." He stood rigid at the base of the stairs, processing the absolute erasure of their past. She was treating his presence as a standard medical transaction, categorizing his dying pack as a mere logistical variable on a ledger. The devastating indifference in her posture proved that the damage was irreversible. She had not simply moved on, she had transcended his existence entirely. The silence in the vast pavilion stretched thick and unyielding, broken only by the crackle of hearth fires. From her position on the raised dais, Lyra Thorne observed the man below her. His posture had collapsed inward. The gold embroidery on his cloak was tarnished with road mud. His knuckles, gripping the petitioner's stand, were stark white and visibly trembling. Moving with deliberate grace, the grand sovereign healer stepped toward the polished obsidian table positioned at the edge of the dais. A pristine velvet cloth rested there, displaying a precisely arranged row of medical instruments. She picked up one of the silver scalpels. The metal caught the ambient light, gleaming with cold perfection. She idly twirled the slender handle between her fingers. It was a casual, fluid motion, born of countless hours excising dead tissue, contrasting sharply with his desperate, shuddering breaths. "The missive delivered by your outriders was largely inadequate," she stated. Her voice carried no malice, only the flat resonance of institutional authority. It mentioned a toxic mist. It did not specify the onset of the necrosis, detail the latency period between the initial exposure and the first failure of the respiratory system. Down in the lower gallery, Julian Vane stared up at her. He blinked, his jaw working silently as he tried to process the reality of the woman standing before him. He was looking for the quiet, submissive Omega who used to shrink under his displeasure. He found only the sharp edge of the sovereign order, the latency period. He repeated, his voice scraping against the back of his throat. 3 days. Perhaps 4. They start coughing blood, the borders are collapsing. The scalpel twirled over her knuckles, a mesmerizing flash of silver. 3 days or 4, Alpha King. In epidemiological terms, 24 hours is the difference between a localized containment and a continental plague. I require precision. He swallowed hard. Sweat beaded at his temples despite the biting chill of the marble room. "I do not know," he admitted, the words visibly costing him his pride. "The garrison healers handle the dying. I only know that the mortality rate is absolute once the fever sets in. My beta fell ill 2 nights ago. His skin was burning, but he shivered like he was freezing." "A paradoxical fever response," she murmured, setting the silver scalpel down onto the velvet cloth with a soft click. She catalogued the symptom instantly, her mind filtering the data through rigorous study. "And the mucosal lining. Is there a distinct blue discoloration before the respiratory collapse?" He shook his head blindly. "I am not a physician. I came here for the cure, not an interrogation. My people are dying." "Your people are dying because you lack the basic observation necessary to describe their suffering," she answered. Not an insult, just a diagnostic fact. The sheer clinical detachment of her assessment hit him harder than any physical blow could have. The man who ruled the Crescent Pack was accustomed to anger, to weeping, to fear. He had no defense against absolute, terrifying competence. He looked at the vast distance between them, at the halberds of the royal sentinels still crossed to bar his path, and realized his authority meant nothing in this room. He needed to change the terrain. If he could not win on the grounds of medical expertise, he would pull her back down into the personal. He took a half-step forward, pressing his chest dangerously close to the iron weapons. "Please," he said. The word was scraped hollow by exhaustion. "You cannot look at me with that cold face. I know you." His voice dropped, losing the booming resonance of an alpha and adopting a low, desperate cadence. "I know the woman beneath those state robes. Do you remember the small garden behind the western keep?" She did not flinch. She did not lean away. She merely watched him, the way one watches a trapped animal gnawing through a steel snare. "The winter roses," he pressed on, pleading for a crack in her composure. You stayed awake for 3 nights during the deep frost just to keep the roots from freezing. You built a canopy of woven straw because the servants were too busy. You could never let anything die. You have a good heart. You cannot let my entire pack freeze in this poison." He waited for the memory to soften her. He waited for the inevitable tears, the quiet surrender that had always defined their dynamic. Instead, she reached for the heavy leather-bound volume resting at the center of the obsidian desk. The provincial ledger hit the stone surface with a resounding thud, kicking up a tiny cloud of dry dust. The sounds instantly shattered the nostalgic atmosphere he had tried to construct, falling as final as a gavel striking wood. "We are discussing the mortality rate in the outer settlements, Alpha King," she said. She flipped the thick parchment pages open, her ink-stained fingers moving with practiced efficiency. "Your memories of Western horticulture are completely irrelevant to the public health crisis currently devastating your borders." He flinched, as if she had struck him across the face. The mention of the garden had been his ultimate concession. She had simply stepped over it, refusing to validate his guilt or his nostalgia. "Lyra, I am begging you," he whispered, the formal titles entirely forgotten. "You will refer to me by my appointed rank, or you will be escorted from the imperial court," she replied. She did not raise her voice. The quiet finality in her tone was backed by the full, crushing weight of the crown. She ran a single finger down the column of faded ink figures in the provincial ledger, entirely consumed by logistical reality. "Now, according to the registry, your pack ceased funding the border purification pylons 2 winters ago. Let us discuss the direct ecological consequences of that specific policy." The provincial ledger rested on a slanted podium of dark ironwood at the center of the dais. It was a massive, intimidating volume bound in cured oxhide, its heavy corners reinforced with tarnished brass. Lyra approached it with measured, deliberate steps. The double-lined silk of her state robes made a soft, uninterrupted whisper against the cold stone floor, a sound that seemed to pull all the remaining warmth from the room. She did not look at the man standing at the base of the steps. Keeping her focus entirely on the brass latch, her pale, sterilized fingers unfastened the lock, letting the thick cover fall open. The scent of dry parchment, crushed gallnut ink, and old dust rose into the chilled air of the grand throne room. Lyra smoothed her hand flat over the right-hand page, her posture perfectly aligned with the rigid geometry of the podium. The crisp, heavy rustle of the ledger pages turning was the only sound in the silent hall. It did not echo as a mere physical noise. It landed like the slow, methodical ticks of a countdown to an inevitable exposure. Down below, Julian stood rigid, his chest rising and falling in shallow, jagged breaths. He was a warrior who understood the immediate threat of bared fangs or drawn steetle, but he possessed no instinctual defense against the quiet, undeniable permanence of administrative data. Lyra found the correct section, her eyes scanning the precise columns of script before she spoke. "Record entry 412, she announced. Her voice carried an acoustic perfection that left no room for debate, echoing cleanly against the vaulted ceiling, dated the 2nd autumn of your reign. A direct decree to divert 3,000 silver talents away from the northern herbal wards, reallocating those critical funds to construct a secondary hunting lodge near the eastern ridge." She paused, letting the numbers settle heavily over the court. Julian's jaw tightened visibly, a muscle ticking wildly beneath his skin. She turned another page. The thick vellum scraped against itself, loud as a sharpening stone. Record entry 430. A mandate to clear-cut the elderbark groves along the provincial border to expand your private grazing lands. Those specific root systems were the natural ecological filter that prevented subterranean rot from reaching the surface. Lyra looked up from the book, her gaze clinical and hollow as it locked onto his tense posture. The toxic mist currently choking your people is not a sudden, unpredictable curse from the gods. It is the direct mathematical result of 3 years of sustained ecological and medical neglect. You stripped the land of its natural immunity to fund your own entertainment, and now the rot has simply risen to claim what is left. Julian gripped the hilt of his ceremonial dagger, his knuckles turning white under the intense pressure. He desperately wanted to shout, to order her to stop reading his failures aloud, but how could a man fight ink? He was finally learning what she had known for a very long time. Ink dried faster than tears in the bitter northern wind, and its verdicts were entirely devoid of mercy. She did not raise her voice to accuse him. She merely read his own signature back to him, weaponizing his past arrogance with absolute, devastating neutrality. High Sovereign Alistair Vance observed the audit from the elevated expanse of the high throne, his chin resting lightly on his knuckles. He had allowed the Grand Healer to conduct her assessment without interruption, trusting her methodical precision completely. He occupied space the way a mountain occupied the horizon, without effort, without the nervous, reactive energy that radiated in waves from the desperate pack leader below. Now, Alistair shifted slightly, the dark velvet of its cloak catching the ambient light. Are the entries read by the Grand Sovereign Healer accurate? Alpha Vane. His voice was a low, resonant drawl. It held no outward anger, yet it carried the crushing, unyielding weight of absolute jurisdiction. Julian's throat worked as he swallowed hard. He was a king within his own borders, accustomed to total obedience, but inside the imperial court, he was merely a failing local administrator facing his supreme commander. He glanced up at Lyra, perhaps hoping to find a flicker of the insecure, eager to please woman he had once known, someone who would soften the blow or offer an excuse on his behalf. He found only a wall of pristine white silk and a pair of eyes as unreadable as frozen lakes. I ask again, Alistair said softly, leaning forward. Are the records accurate? Julian exhaled a harsh, defeated breath. They are. Alistair gestured to the master scribe waiting in the shadows. Then you will formalize your confession. The Sovereign Medical Order does not release the royal frost herbs to a province unless the reigning leader signs an admission of gross administrative failure, legally transferring oversight of the recovery to the crown. The scribe hurried forward, carrying a freshly inked parchment and a heavy iron quill. He placed the document on a low marble consultation table situated at the very base of the dais, directly between the high throne and the petitioner's standing floor. The table was designed for seated clerks and minor functionaries, not for the convenience of standing royalty. Julian stepped forward, his heavy boots dragging slightly against the polished stone. He stared down at the document. The text was written in a dense, tight script, outlining his complete negligence and formally stripping him of his autonomy over the incoming medical supplies. To read the fine print of his own documented failure, Julian had to bend his knees. He had to lower his head. The proud alpha of the Crescent Pack was forced to kneel slightly to read the lower signature line. It was a physical bow that broke his rigid posture entirely. The geometry of the room forced his broad shoulders to round, his spine to curve in an unnatural submission right beneath the hem of Lyra's white robes. The heavy silence of the massive stone sanctuary pressed down on him as he took the iron quill from the scribe. The dark ink smelled sharply of copper and crushed resin. Lyra watched his struggle without a single trace of triumph. Her pulse remained perfectly steady beneath her serene exterior. She experienced the subtle, melancholic weight of witnessing exactly what she had always known to be true. The man who had once demanded she make herself small was now folding himself in half just to survive the consequences of his own pride. The metal nib scratched harshly against the rough paper, the sound echoing like tearing linen. Julian signed his name to the bottom of the page, surrendering his authority to the archives forever. The recess bell tolled somewhere deep within the imperial sanctuary, its low brass vibration settling into the cold marble floor of the high gallery. Lyra Thorne stood near the tall vaulted windows, her posture a steady vertical line against the grey northern light. She watched the distant snowfields, calculating the precise transport time required for the antidotes to reach the outer provincial borders. Her mind was entirely occupied with logistics, carriage horses, and the fragile arithmetic of physical survival. She did not turn when rushed, uneven footsteps echoed down the empty corridor. The scent of rain-soaked wool, ozone, and bitter wood smoke announced the arrival of the Northern Border's leader long before he spoke. Julian Vane moved with the frantic, uncalculated urgency of a man who felt the ground cracking beneath his boots. The polished veneer of his royal persona had fractured completely during the public reading of his failures. He intercepted her path along the stone balustrade, cutting off her route back to the inner chambers. His chest heaved under his damp coat. The silence between them stretched out thick and heavy, a chasm constructed from 3 years of absolute distance. "You have made your point," Julian said. His voice was a harsh, low rasp, cracking at the edges and entirely stripped of its usual commanding resonance. He stepped closer, leaning forward as if physical proximity could somehow rewrite the legal reality of the morning. "You humiliated me before the High Court. You proved to everyone that you understand the provincial supply lines better than my entire council. You won." The heroine kept her gaze fixed on the frosted glass of the window pane. She did not flinch, did not cross her arms in defense, and did not offer him the satisfaction of an emotional reaction. She simply stood still, holding her ground without the nervous impulse to fill the void. "Come back to the territory," he urged, the raw desperation finally breaking through his pride. This was not a romantic confession. It was the frantic, panicked calculation of a ruler who recognized an administrative asset he desperately needed to salvage his failing empire. "I will annul the political alliances immediately. I will dissolve the current marital treaties by nightfall. The elders will not dare object to you now. You can return to the Crescent Pack as the High Luna. You will have absolute control over the medical wards, the distribution lines, the treasury, everything you originally asked for." He reached out, his hand moving automatically to grasp the sleeve of her garment, an old instinct to pull her into his space and command her attention. But his hand froze in mid-air. He stopped barely an inch from the pristine fabric. The Alpha King stared at his own outstretched fingers. The skin around his knuckles was rough, cracked, and deeply stained with the dark, oily soot of the burning provincial borders, the physical residue of the very territory he had fatally neglected. The stark, undeniable contrast between his ruined, desperate hands and the flawless white silk of her authority stopped him completely. He lowered his arm slowly, curling his soot-stained fingers into a tight, trembling fist against his side. He felt the particular kind of pain that comes not from surprise, but from confirmation. He could not touch her. He no longer possessed the clearance, the rank, or the right. The gallery remained painfully quiet, save for the distant sound of winter wind rattling the high glass panes. Lyra finally turned her head to look at him. There was no anger in her eyes. There was no lingering bitterness, no hidden resentment, and no vindictive triumph. Her expression was entirely clinical, carrying the detached, polite observation of a healer diagnosing a stranger's wound. "You misunderstand the nature of this institution," she said softly. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. It carried perfectly through the cold, empty stone hall. "And you profoundly misunderstand me." She looked down at the space where his hand had hovered just moments ago. Deliberately, she lifted her own hands and smoothed down the pristine silk of her state robes. The gesture was unhurried, grounded, and intensely peaceful. She pressed the heavy, double-lined fabric flat against her sides, straightening the silver embroidery that marked her supreme station. It was a physical confirmation of her identity, signaling her complete, unshakable satisfaction with the life she had built from nothing. "The Sovereign Medical Order is not a temporary refuge," Lyra explained, her tone steady and even. "It is a lifetime vow. I swore an oath to the High Registry, binding my skills to the preservation of the entire realm, not just one fractured territory. My contract here is permanent." Julian stared at her, his jaw tight, his chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths. He searched her face for any crack in her composure, any small sign that she still harbored the quiet, desperate love she had once held for him. He found absolutely nothing. Her emotional distance was absolute. The woman who had once packed a single wooden trunk and walked out of his keep in the dead of night was gone. "I am offering you your rightful place," the ex-husband insisted, though the words sounded hollow even to him. "I am offering you the crown you were meant to wear. You are offering me a cage that I have already outgrown," the Grand Sovereign Healer replied simply. She did not raise her chin or posture for dominance. She did not need to prove her strength to a man who had entirely lost his own. "I do not want your medical wards. I do not want your political annulments, and I certainly have no desire to be your High Lunar." She stepped past him, leaving the cold draft of the window behind. Her movements were smooth, unimpeded, and completely free of hesitation. Julian remained frozen against the stone balustrade, watching the flawless white train of her robes glide across the marble floor. He realized then, with a devastating leaden certainty, that her refusal was not a negotiation. It was not a punishment meant to teach him a lesson. It was simply the truth. She had not built her power to make him regret losing her. She had built it to ensure she would never have to depend on a man like him again. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the high gallery did not slam, nor did they swing with the violent urgency typical of provincial alphas. They opened with a slow, measured groan of ancient iron hinges. High Sovereign Alistair Vance stepped into the corridor. The monarch inhabited the quiet, the way lesser rulers occupied speech. Entirely without apology, lacking any nervous impulse to fill the void. He wore the deep charcoal velvet of his station, the silver crest of the imperial sovereign court gleaming dully against the dark, heavy fabric. Julian stiffened, his broad shoulders tensing as the territorial instinct within him flared, anticipating a challenge. He braced himself for a roar, a display of dominance, or a bared fang. That was how conflicts were settled in the Crescent borders. But the sovereign ruler of the capital did not operate on the crude mechanics of pack biology. He did not issue a warning growl. He did not even look at the visiting leader. Instead, Alistair walked with unhurried grace, his boots making absolutely no sound on the polished jade tiles. He glided directly into the space between the cornered man and Lyra Thorne, effectively severing their line of sight. It was a physical barrier made of calm, unyielding institutional power. The monarch did not draw a blade. He did not summon the royal sentinels, waiting in the shadows of the archway. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his coat, withdrew a square of freshly pressed white linen, and offered it to the Grand Sovereign Healer. "The drafts in these upper passages can sometimes falter," Alistair murmured, his voice a low, even cadence that echoed off the cold stone walls. "I find that exposure to certain provincial elements leaves a lingering residue. You should wipe your hands." Lyra accepted the linen handcloth without a flicker of surprise. She smoothed the pristine fabric over her knuckles, the deliberate friction creating a faint, dry sound in the tense silence of the corridor. She did not look at her ex-husband. She looked only at the cloth, treating the encounter precisely as the monarch had framed it, an exposure to a mild, unfortunate contagion that required basic cleansing protocol. The visitor watched the exchange, his throat tightening until the air felt too thin to breathe. The blood rushing to his ears burned hotter than any physical strike. He was not being treated as a rival alpha, nor as a former mate worthy of a duel. His was being managed as a minor contagion. The Empire stood behind her career, forming an impenetrable wall of medical and legal hierarchy that rendered his territorial titles completely irrelevant. He had come to bargain with a woman he thought he owned, only to find himself dismissed by a system that considered his presence a common nuisance. Alistair finally turned his head, his pale eyes resting on the man with clinical detachment. "If your petition is concluded, the guest quarters have been prepared in the lower ward. The Grand Healer has significant formulations to oversee. She will not be interrupted again." The visitor took a slow, unsteady step backward. The jade floor felt uneven beneath his boots, as if the foundation of the world he understood had cracked wide open. For 3 years, Julian Vane had carried a quiet, unspoken assumption in the back of his mind. He had always believed that, no matter the distance, the biological reality of their fated mate bond would eventually pull her back into his orbit. A mating bond was supposed to be an unbreakable tether of blood and spirit, a primal anchor that defied logic and law. In a frantic, instinctive bid to regain some illusion of control, he closed his eyes and pushed his consciousness outward. His wolf whined, a pathetic, scraping sound, echoing in the hollows of his chest. He reached blindly through the spiritual ether, searching for the familiar hum of her presence. He looked for the quiet, subservient warmth that used to define the Omega he had married. He sought the tether that would prove she still belonged to him on some fundamental, unavoidable level. He found absolutely nothing. There was no violent severing. There was no magical curse, no dramatic ritual of rejection that left a bleeding wound in his soul. The thread had not been cut. It simply no longer existed. Where he expected to find the spiritual weight of his mate, he met a vast, echoing void. He tried to pull her scent from the air, desperate for the familiar smell of rain and cedar that used to cling to her skin in their old life. Instead, the atmosphere around her radiated the clean, sterile sharpness of ozone, crushed frost herbs, and cold mint. She had not just survived his cruelty, she had fundamentally evolved beyond it. Her ascent into the supreme ranks of the sovereign medical order had burned away the biological subjection of her past. She was a different entity entirely, fortified by her own intellect and shielded by her earned authority. The bond had starved in the bitter northern wind, and her self-actualization had filled the empty space, leaving no room for a territorial alpha's claim. The alpha experienced a very specific kind of physical hollowness, a collapse born not from a sudden blow, but from absolute, undeniable confirmation. The realization settled in his chest like a heavy stone, dropping through still water, slow, thorough, filling every crack. He was standing mere inches away from the woman who held the medicine to save his bloodline, yet she was further out of his reach than the distant stars are. The sudden absence of the bond hollowed him out, leaving a cold, ringing silence in his ears as he stared at the empty space where she had just stood, having dismissed him entirely to return to her work. Far from the oppressive tension of the high gallery, the air inside the sterile preparation chamber smelled of crushed mint, ozone, and the sharp, metallic tang of recently polished silver scalpels. Lyra Thorne stepped up to the long marble counter, the pristine silk of her state robes brushing softly against the cold stone floor. She did not pause to rest, nor did she allow the lingering tension from the confrontation to slow her movements. Cassie Miller was already waiting beside the brass weighing scales, her posture quiet and attentive. Spread across the dark slate working board were the raw materials required for the provincial cure. The frost herbs radiated a faint, bioluminescent blue glow in the dim light of the laboratory, casting strange, cold shadows across the stone walls. Lyra reached out, her bare fingers brushing the delicate, ice-covered leaves. The temperature of the plants was freezing, biting into her skin like winter frost, yet her hands remained perfectly steady. She selected the sharpest of her specialized tools. The silver scalpels were forged specifically for this exact botanical dissection, designed to sever the toxic veins of the plant without bruising the medicinal core. She made the first cut. The stems snapped with a crisp, echoing sound in the quiet room. Cassie handed the senior healer the glass vials one by one, her movements a silent testament to their shared rhythm of daily labor. The grand healer portioned the glowing blue extract with absolute mathematical precision. She did not rush. She did not let a single milligram of the rare substance go to waste. There were hundreds of innocent lives suffering within the borders of his ancestral lands. Children, elders, and working Omegas who had merely stood in the background while Julian Vane made his arrogant decrees. Lyra felt a profound sense of duty toward them. Her healing was not a weapon, nor was it a bargaining chip to punish the man who had cast her aside. It was a strict clinical mandate. She worked with the quiet strength of a woman who had long ago separated her personal history from her professional ethics. The crushed frost herbs turned into a shimmering, luminescent paste which she carefully diluted with distilled glacial water. She filled the first heavy amber vial, sealing it with a thick cork and dripping hot beeswax over the top to protect the integrity of the cure. 3 years ago, she might have wept over the thought of her former home being ravaged by a toxic mist. Now, she simply counted the finished doses, verifying the quantities against the provincial ledger to ensure the exact amount required to neutralize the blight. She arranged the completed medicines into a reinforced wooden travel case, locking the iron latches with a firm, decisive click. The corridor outside the Imperial Registry was a drafty expanse of vaulted ceilings and heavy limestone pillars, entirely devoid of the emotional theatrics that usually accompanied provincial politics. Garrick Stone stood near the arched entryway, his heavy leather armor looking dull and worn beneath the harsh light of the iron sconces. The enforcer of the Crescent Pack had always carried himself with a stern, unyielding pride, executing the will of his territory with blunt force. But as Lyra approached, carrying the heavy wooden case of formulated medicine, his rigid posture faltered. She had deliberately bypassed the protocol of summoning the Alpha King for the final handover. Julian did not deserve the intimacy of a personal closure, nor did Lyra have any interest in humoring his lingering desperation. She chose to execute the transfer through the appropriate military channel, reducing the entire crisis to a simple administrative transaction. Garrick stepped forward, the heavy boots of his uniform scraping awkwardly against the polished marble. He looked at the locked crate, then lifted his gaze to the woman holding it. He did not see the quiet, invisible Omega he had once escorted to the borders in disgrace. He saw the supreme authority of the Sovereign Order, cloaked in untouchable white silk, holding the sole salvation of his entire bloodline. The stern enforcer did not speak a single word of defense or justification. Instead, he lowered his broad shoulders, bending at the waist in a deep, slow, and absolute bow of reverence. It was a gesture of complete submission to her authority, an acknowledgement of his own past blindness and her undeniable supremacy. Lyra nodded faintly, her expression a mask of polite, measured distance. She extended her arms, allowing him to take the tightly sealed iron lock box containing the cure. The weight shifted from her hands to his, severing the last physical tie she held to the disease ravaging their lands. She offered no instructions, no words of comfort, and no final message to be passed along to his superior. The medicine was perfect. The ledger entries were balanced. The transaction was officially concluded. Not because she wished to be cruel, but because she simply had nothing left to give them. Garrick clutched the iron lock box to his armored chest, his jaw tight with unspoken gratitude and profound, irreversible regret. Turning away smoothly, her white state robe swept silently over the cold stone. She walked back toward the safety of the infirmary, leaving the enforcer standing alone in the shadows, holding the cure that had cost his alpha everything. Moving into the public corridors, Garrick Stone waited by the iron-reinforced doors of the transit hall. The stone floor held the unforgiving chill of the northern mountains. He held the tightly sealed iron lock box securely in his right hand. Inside rested the exact dosage of the formulated frost herbs, protected in padded velvet. In his left hand he balanced the massive, leather-bound provincial ledger. The brass hinges of the book gleamed faintly under the flickering torches, reflecting the austere crests of the sovereign medical order carved into the walls. There were no banners here, only the quiet machinery of imperial law. Julian stepped into the hall. His posture was unrecognizable compared to the arrogant Alpha, who had entered the capital mere hours ago. The muscles in his shoulders sagged under a crushing weight. He approached the enforcer of the High Court slowly, his eyes fixing on the iron lock box. That small metal container held the survival of the Crescent Pack and the definitive proof of his own absolute failure. Garrick Stone met his gaze, his presence carrying the cold resonance of a man who served only the law. He laid the heavy provincial ledger onto the nearest stone plinth. The book landed with a dull, authoritative thud that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Garrick opened the heavy cover, flipping past pages of meticulous imperial records until he found a freshly inscribed sheet. The ink was still slightly damp, smelling sharply of crushed gallnuts and soot. Julian stared at the page. The terms of the clinical debt registry were laid out in precise, uncompromising calligraphy. The sovereign medical order was not a charity, and the Crescent Pack was now legally bound to provide for them. He read the clauses, his jaw tightening as the numerical reality set in. 50 years. For the next 5 decades, half of his territory's agricultural yield, their prime timber harvests, and all eastern border tariffs would be directly diverted to the capital's infirmary. It was a crippling economic subjugation. There was no negotiation. There was no appeal to ancient alliances, and no room for posturing. Lyra had not fought him. She had simply let the administrative weight of the High Court grind his pride into dust, reducing him to a dependent debtor with a few strokes of a silver quill. "Sign the registry," Garrick instructed, holding out a pen. Julian reached for the quill. His fingers were stiff, trembling slightly in the damp draught of the corridor. The cold iron of the plinth seeped into his skin through the thick parchment. He pressed the nib to the paper. The scratching sound was loud in the silent hall, a harsh noise that felt like the scraping of bone. He wrote his name, then pressed his royal seal into the hot red wax Garrick poured beside the signature. The absolute victory belonged to the woman who had once stood quietly in his shadow. Garrick inspected the signature, nodded once, and closed the ledger with a definitive snap. He handed over the iron lock box. Julian took it. The metal was freezing. The northern wind howled through the high arches of the capital gates, driving sheets of grey rain across the slick cobblestones. Julian walked alone down the wide avenue leading out of the city. The storm had broken suddenly, turning the sky into a bruised canopy of charcoal and steel. Water poured from the eaves of the ancient stone buildings, splashing against his heavy boots. He did not call for a carriage or summon his remaining guards to flank him. He simply walked, carrying the iron lock box against his chest like a shield that had already failed. The rain soaked through his heavy traveling cloak within minutes. The wool became a suffocating weight, dragging down his shoulders and clinging to his arms like a wet shroud. The chill penetrated his layers, sinking deep into his joints. He pulled the wet fabric tightly around his chest, shivering as the icy water ran down his neck. When he had left the transit hall, a faint, lingering scent of sterile herbs and clean linen had clung to his skin, a microscopic trace of the air she now commanded. As the storm battered him, he realized the heavy rain was washing it away. The deluge was scrubbing the very last physical trace of her from his existence. Before he passed under the final iron portcullis, he stopped. He turned around, his boots sinking slightly into the freezing mud at the edge of the paved road. Through the blinding downpour, he looked back at the imperial capital. High above the sprawling fortress, the white towers of the great jade hall pierced the storm clouds. The pristine stone glowed faintly in the gloom, untouchable and serene amidst the violent chaos of the weather. She was up there. Lyra was standing in her immaculate white state robes, surrounded by sterilized silver scalpels and the quiet respect of the highest authorities in the realm. He inhaled deeply, desperately searching for her scent one last time. There was nothing, only the metallic tang of wet iron, the bitter smell of crushed pine needles in the mud, and the harsh ozone of the storm. The realization settled in his chest like a stone dropping through still water. The severance was absolute. There would be no dramatic reconciliations, no future where she looked at him with anything other than clinical indifference. He had traded his pride and his pack's financial independence for a box of medicine, and in return, he had been erased from her world entirely. Julian turned away from the high white towers. He lowered his head against the driving wind, tightened his grip on the freezing iron lock box, and stepped through the gates, walking out into the cold, empty northern road. The heavy oak door of the private sanctuary closed with a soft, definitive click, shutting out the echoing chill of the grand corridors. Inside, the hearth fire had burned down to a deep, steady bed of orange embers, radiating a dry heat that smelled faintly of roasted black tea and burning cedar. Lyra sat in the high-backed leather chair, her posture relaxing fractionally as the ambient warmth began to seep into her tired muscles. She held a fragile porcelain cup between her hands, letting the steam rise against her face. Across the low iron table, Alistair Vance sat in comfortable repose. The High Sovereign occupied the space with a measured stillness, lacking the nervous impulse that drove lesser men to fill quiet rooms with unnecessary words. He watched the flames map shadows across the stone floor, his dark velvet cloak unclasped and draped casually over the armrest. It was not the silence of a ruler demanding attention, but the silence of an equal offering rest. Alistair reached for the iron kettle resting on the hearthstone. He poured a small measure of hot water into his own cup, the sound a soft, rhythmic trickle in the quiet room. She studied the slow, deliberate motion of his hands. They were steady, unhurried, the hands of a man who commanded empires through definitive ledgers rather than drawn swords. He set the kettle down and glanced toward her cup. A faint, rare line of amusement softened the strict architecture of his jaw. "You have a stray leaf clinging to the rim," the Sovereign noted, his voice a low, steady murmur. Lyra lowered the cup, tracing her thumb along the delicate porcelain edge. The single black tea leaf clung stubbornly to the white glaze. She did not brush it away. "The diviners in the lower ward would say it is an omen," Alistair continued, taking a slow sip of his own brew, a single leaf-breaking formation. "They would likely claim it signifies the northern guilds, preparing a petition for better trade routes before the winter frost sets in. The diviners in the lower ward also believe that hanging dried rosemary over a doorway prevents the provincial blight," she answered, setting the cup onto its matching saucer with a quiet clink. "If the northern guilds want new trade routes, they will have to file a formal request through the registry, not through my tea leaves." Alistair exhaled a quiet breath that might have been a laugh. He did not push the conversation toward the events of the afternoon. He did not ask how she felt about the man who had just been escorted from the capital gates. That was the particular safety of his presence. He required no emotional autopsies, no tearful confessions. The boundary between them remained firmly intact, built not on cold distance, but on absolute respect for her privacy. They sat together in the firelight, two architects of the state, sharing the simple, profound relief of a completed day. Dawn broke over the imperial capital in a wash of pale, fractured gold. The light filtered through the high-arched skylights of the Grand Royal Infirmary, cutting geometric patterns across the pristine stone floor. Lyra stood entirely alone in the center of the laboratory. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the sharp, clean scent of crushed peppermint and sterile alcohol. She ran her fingertips along the polished edge of the central oak workbench, tracing the grain of the wood. Every glass vial, every brass scale, every silver tool rested exactly where it belonged. It was a kingdom of absolute order, built entirely by her own hands. She turned toward the tall, narrow window that overlooked the southern courtyard. The heavy, double-lined fabric of her state robes shifted around her legs, with a soft, whisper-like friction. The silk was heavy, grounding her in the present reality of her rank. The pristine white material did not signify innocence, nor did it represent the fragile expectations of a mating ceremony. It was the armor of her supreme authority. It was proof of her undeniable competence, woven into every thread. Outside, the northern wind whipped through the bare branches of the courtyard elms, carrying the bitter promise of deep winter. 3 years ago, that same wind had frozen the tears on her face. As she walked away from a life that had tried to reduce her to nothing, she remembered the biting cold, the gravel under her boots, the suffocating weight of being invisible. But memory no longer possessed the power to draw blood. The past had been reduced to a simple, archived fact, securely locked away in a ledger she no longer needed to read. Lyra raised her hand, resting her palm against the cold glass of the window pane. Then, slowly, she drew her hand back and pressed her fingertips against her own cheek. The morning sunlight poured through the glass, warming her skin. It was a tangible, steady heat. Her breath moved in a slow, even rhythm, catching the light in a faint mist before dissipating into the empty room. She did not feel the phantom sting of old rejections. She did not feel the hollow ache of a severed bond. She felt only the solid, unyielding certainty of her own existence. The infirmary bells began to toll in the distance, a deep and resonant chime signaling the start of the clinical hours. Footsteps would soon echo in the lower halls. Acolytes would arrive with fresh documents and new provincial reports. The machinery of the High Court would awaken, and it would look to her for direction. Lyra lowered her hand, her posture straightening with effortless grace. She turned away from the window, leaving the ghosts of the past to the cold wind outside, and walked calmly toward the waiting day.